Hi guys, this is Adam here. I saw the swing of a 16-year-old guy on the left here on the forum. I thought it was a really good swing. There's lots of good movements in it. And some of the advice in the comments, I know it's all well-meaning. And much of it is actually good observation, but I might not recommend it for this player. So what I'm going to do is go through some of that advice. And I know it's kind of hard to hear. And really my goal isn't to kind of discredit people. I hate doing that, but it's more to educate you on cause and effect and to avoid this player, because as I said, this player has a really good swing, has lots of good moves in it. Yes, there are some funky things, but they're actually symptoms of something much simpler. And so if you can get a little bit more education from this, then hopefully it's a win-win for everybody. I know it can be a little difficult to hear, so I won't put any names in here. But when I look at this player, he's suffering with a hook and occasional thin shots. And to me, it's clear that the first thing I see is the strong grip. Now, there are some players who have strong grips and they can kind of get away with it. But if a player's suffering with a hook, then it's kind of one of those low-hanging fruit things to change. So, compare this grip to, say, Tiger. And I don't use models to say you have to swing exactly like Tiger, but there are certain things that we can pick up from it. So we can see the left hand. If I were to draw a line straight up through the club shaft for both players, and then what I'm going to do is put a big yellow dot on the lead wrist. So this is the soft part of the wrist. If you poke around, you'll see bone either side of it, or you'll feel bone either side of it. Then there will be a soft part. And you can see with Tiger, that's directly over the grip. So that's a very neutral position. Whereas for the 16-year-old kid, it's in a much stronger position. You can see more knuckles, you can see more of the logo, and that wrist is more turned to the right as he would view it, turned to the left as we can see it here. And that's just a face closing move. If I give 100 golfers a stronger grip, they're going to close the face as a result of that. And we can even see the effect that has on the right hand. Then you can see more of his fingernails, whereas Tiger's right hand is much more on top. The V created between the thumb and the forefinger for Tiger points more towards his chin, whereas for this player it's pointing out here somewhere. So I actually have a visual of the grip. So this is me taking my grip, and you can see the left hand as we talked about, and with the right hand it's much more in the fingers, and that palm then sits on top. If anything, I'd say my grip is slightly weaker here. I'm over exaggerating it because this player has a stronger grip, so I'm just trying to get the point across in a way, but somewhere between those two grips would be absolutely fine. So as I said, with a strong grip, that's going to close the face, all else being equal, and that's why this player is suffering with left shots. As they start to hit lots of shots left, instinctively, and bear in mind I have seen lots and lots of players develop over time, instinctively players who are hitting it left will start to swing more to the right. And when you start to swing more to the right, the low point of the swing starts to move back, which results in fat shots. Then the next chain reaction event from that is the player will start to shift excessively forwards in order to get the low point further forwards. Otherwise they're going to hit lots of thins and fats, which is what this player is struggling with. So they're kind of early on in this development cycle, and in my opinion they need to change that grip early on. Otherwise more and more symptoms are going to start to occur from that. Now I know the first thing that most people mention, and it is true, it is a good observation, and in this player it is excessive, is that lead arm movement, or some people call that a chicken wing. So the lead arm separates from the body. Now I wouldn't change that at first. I would let that change itself over time as a result of the grip, because it is actually a good movement for the lead arm to fold. And I will show you what I mean. Not in this way. I know this is excessive and it's in the wrong direction. So what I mean by that, if I bring up a few players, so here's Garcia, and if I get him in the follow through, and the reason why I'm using down the line is very specific. You can see that lead arm is folding. It is not staying poker straight. The lead arm is folding. We have John Rahm here, and in the follow through again you can see that lead arm is folding. Justin Thomas hitting a hold off shot here. And once again, if we get him into the follow through, you can see that lead arm is folding. So what's the difference here? Why does that player look strange? Well, the difference is forearm supination. So I wouldn't stop the lead arm folding. We would get those forearms to supinate a little bit more. And what I mean by that, supination is just forearm. You could call it rolling over or twisting. Look up supination on Google. It'll give you a nice image of that. So bringing back Tiger from here, it's clear to see. You can see the gloved hand here is under the lead hand. So he is rolling his forearms over a little bit more. I don't like using the terms rolling the forearms over. I prefer closing the face. Whereas for the 16-year-old player, we can see that even at this point in the swing, the gloved hand is still on top. So this player is holding on for dear life, because he knows that if he rotates the forearm over like Tiger, he's going to hit it way to the left. And we can see even here, the gloved hand is still on top, still on top, still on top, still on top. It starts to go under just around there. So it's very, very late folding of the forearms or rolling over the forearms. However, before you go out and do that, we have to fix the grip, because that move is actually, it's a good move for him at the moment. Due to his grip being so strong at setup, that creates a club face closing move. So the hold off that he's doing, the limiting of the forearm rotation, is trying to keep the face open. If he didn't do that, he would snap hook it off the planet. So that's why I said I wouldn't necessarily fix that lead arm movement just yet. Get the grip changed. He will probably hit a few more blocks out to the right, and then that lead forearm can supinate more. It may even happen naturally. It may even start to happen as a result of a better grip. Now, some people mentioned the ball is too far forwards. It needs to move back in his stance. Well, I don't see that personally. In fact, that could be something that would make him worse. So if I draw a line up, you know, how I look at ball position is kind of relative to the head. And you can see Tiger's ball position here is opposite the lead ear. For this player, that ball position is farther back than that in his stance. So I certainly wouldn't move that ball farther back in his stance. In fact, as I said, it can actually make a player worse, because if you visualize, this is the club head coming into impact, and this is the swing arc. So the problem with placing the ball farther back in the stance, if we moved it back here, for example, let me do it in white. If we moved the ball back here, then what that does, it actually makes the swing path more in to out. And all else being equal, that's going to produce a bigger hook. And this player is suffering with hook shots, so we don't want to give this player more in to out swing, because he's going to get more pushes, more hooks. It's just not a good piece of advice for this player. Someone mentioned this player had a weak grip. That's not true at all. This player's grip is very, very strong. And they also mentioned they should lean the shaft forwards more. So they actually showed a picture where they wanted the club to point towards the lead hip. That's quite excessive. That's actually pointing outside of the lead hip there. And again, just to bring Tiger back, and the reason why I use Tiger is obviously it's an inarguable model, because this was Tiger in 2001. This is when he was absolutely dominating, and you can see that grip points towards the belt, or just slightly ahead of the belt, which it does for this player as well. Points in the same position. So I would say that shaft lean is a good amount of the dress. In fact, if you were to lean the shaft forwards more, that tends to strengthen the grip further, and that would make more hook shots for this player. So we really don't want to do that. Someone mentioned he never gets his mass ahead of the golf ball. Well, here's a line for the golf ball. So they said he never gets the mass ahead of the golf ball at impact. Well, let's fast forward him to impact. And let's fast forward Tiger to the same position there. Well, you can see that player has more of his mass ahead. So there's more of his lead ear. You can see the left ear is ahead of it. Even the back hip is on that line of the ball, whereas Tiger has more of the mass behind that. So I would say this player doesn't have an issue with getting his mass forwards. If anything, it's excessive. Now, there's a simple fix to that. I would actually just narrow the stance a little bit and flare the lead foot out of the dress. But it's not an issue at the moment. Again, this is one of those symptoms. Because this player started to swing too much from in to out, which moves the low point back, he's starting to shift his weight excessively and figure out ways of getting his weight forwards more to move that low point into a better position. So again, this is all a symptom of the strong grip. And if someone says that, oh, well, he doesn't shift his weight, well, from the top of the swing, here's Tiger. Just draw a line on the hip. And we see from there to impact, there is a significant weight shift forwards. So Tiger's hips get to here by impact, his hips get to here. So there's a good amount of weight shift forwards in both. In fact, it's a nice amount from this player. As someone mentioned, the lead knee moving in and down. Yes, it does. It does. So there's the lead knee movement, and you'll see with Tiger it is less so, much less so. However, we have to realize that this is a kind of modern phenomena. You do see a little bit of lead movement down and forwards from Tiger, but the resisting of the hip turn from these modern swings, that's more of a modern phenomenon. It was kind of brought in by David Ledbetter, Jim McLean, those guys. But I want to point out that's not necessarily a bad move. And I'm going to highlight that with Jack Nicklaus. And so here's Jack Nicklaus with a driver. And I will draw a dot on his knee. And if we get him to the top of his swing, Nicklaus has a much more pronounced... In fact, that lead knee movement is even more forwards, or behind the ball rather. And we can see very similar body positions from both players. So why does Nicklaus do that? Well, it wasn't commonly taught back in Nicklaus's day to keep those hips restricted. I know the person who mentioned this say that it actually stops the hips turning. It doesn't. If you allow that lead knee to move in, it can actually increase the amount of rotation of the hips. So back in Nicklaus's day, and if you look at loads of guys, Sam Snead, Bobby Jones, all those older guys, pre-teaching era, all of them moved the lead knee in like that. So it's not a bad move. I wouldn't change that at all in this player. And some people are saying, well, he slides in the backswing. Well, this is a stabilized image. I actually took the image of the player and I stabilized the image because the camera was moving around a little bit. And so if I draw a line on the back hip, you see this player doesn't sway. He turns beautifully into his right hip. He doesn't sway at all. And just like Nicklaus, if you look at Nicklaus, he turns the hips, there's no sway. It's a very good movement from both players. In fact, we could argue when we bring Tiger back in, and you can highlight this even with looking at the head movement. So I'll draw a circle around both players' heads. And this player goes to the top. There's no sway there. There's a drop in height, but there's no sway there. Whereas from Tiger, there's actually a little bit more sway. There's a little bit more movement into his right side. So I wouldn't say that this player sways too much. Now, one player mentioned a very astute observation that the best players in the world, they kind of drop their lead shoulder in transition. Again, that is a good observation. You can see Tiger here from the top of the swing to halfway in the downswing. That's usually when it happens. There will be a drop in height of the shoulder. Whereas this player, for the same position, he gets his lead shoulder up earlier. It doesn't move down. Well, you could attribute that. Unfortunately, if he tried to implement that, it might make him worse. And the reason for that is the difference in where the player drops. So if I draw a line on the head here and draw a line on Tiger's head, we can see in the backswing, this player has more of a drop in the backswing, whereas Tiger stays kind of level in the backswing. So that affords Tiger the room to drop in transition, which 90% of tour players do. This player is very deep now. The 16-year-old player is already very deep. If he drops further, he's probably going to hit a lot of fat shots, especially with his rightward swing direction. So this player has learned then to actually spring up earlier. Again, the spring up move is not a bad thing. It's just if it happens too early. But again, to get that player to drop his lead shoulder in transition might make him worse. It might make him fat a few more shots. I would say he would need to maintain his height a little bit more in the backswing if he wants to implement that move. But that's probably not something I would work on with this player for a while. So what would I do with this player? Well, I've mentioned it throughout this. It's really simple. I would, number one, narrow the stance a little bit, because that will stop any excessive weight shift towards the target. I would flare that lead foot out a little bit, so instead of pointing it at the camera, I would point it a little bit more out, as you can see with Tiger here. And what that's going to do is it's going to encourage more rotation of the body instead of more shift towards the target. But the number one thing I would do is I would weaken that grip. You can see it's a very strong position. We've already talked about it. That closes the face, which makes him hook it left, which then has a knock-on effect to the weight shift, which is trying to shift the low point forwards, has a knock-on effect to his swing direction. It has a knock-on effect to that hold-off move that he has, the chicken, which relates to the chicken wing. So all the things that everybody's highlighting is actually just a symptom of that strong grip. Now the difficulty here is the strong grip is going to be really difficult to change. I know, because I've changed enough grips in players, and changing from a stronger to a weaker position it's so difficult. It feels horrible, and it may screw the player up in the short term. But what's going to screw the player up worse is leaving that grip in the long term. His swing direction is going to go more right, his weight shift is going to be even further, his hook is going to be exacerbated even more. He might actually be a decent driver of the ball with that kind of move, but it's going to be very difficult for him to strike irons crisply. I know someone mentioned he might start to hit up on the irons a bit more. That is true, because as we start to swing more right, the low point shifts back, which makes you hit more up on the ball. Overall, change the grip, do it slowly, weaken it off. And by weaken, I'm talking about the position of the grip, not necessarily how tight he's holding it. So as I said, the main points are get that V between the thumb and forefinger pointing up somewhere between the shoulder, the right shoulder and the cheek, 2 knuckles, and mainly get that lead wrist joint, which is in red here, get that over the grip of the club more. And then with the right hand, as I said, much more in the fingers, and that palm will sit much more on top of the club, so you'll be able to see 2 knuckles on the right hand. Maybe at first go somewhere between his existing grip and this one, because too big a change, he's going to spray everywhere. It's going to be really uncomfortable. It may take a good month before this player starts to feel comfortable with the grip, so do it slowly over time. But as I said, if you're looking for long-term benefits for this player, if you change that grip, it's going to have a good knock-on effect to all the other symptoms. It'll just cascade down the chain. So hopefully this has been a little bit educational for you. It's looking at cause and effect. Don't deal with the symptoms of the change, the chicken wing, the hold off finish, the weight shift. Deal with the cause, which is the grip first, and the rest will solve itself.